Good morning and welcome everybody to this DSO Conference for Electricity North West. Apologies if there's a little bit of sorting out of the stage around me. We just go with the flow, it's fine. But welcome to you all and to this event in Penrith today. It's lovely to see so many people in the room. I think we're still expecting a few people to arrive, so and on cue. So we'll just welcome them to the front of the tables at the front where there's lots of space. So no worries there. You might have a couple of people just brushing past as we go. Now I've got to work out with these buttons. Here we go. So Electricity North West always starts their events and meetings with a safety moment. We are electricity is an intrinsically dangerous substance, but working with it carefully means that it's entirely safe. So what we always do is we have our safety moment. Our safety moment within the business at the moment is driver safety, and I think that's particularly pertinent as we arrive in this venue in Cumbria today, given the incidents that have been happening on the M6 in recent days. So for those of you who have driven here today, please remember to drive home very, very safely. There, a bit of housekeeping, which also includes some of the safety moments as well, is that there is no planned fire drill for those of you who are here in person. We have got some people joining us online, and we are being videoed so people can have the joy of watching us all again later. So there are no planned fire drills. If it goes off, follow us all out of the building as quickly as possible. The muster point is the main car park at the front of the hotel. There's plenty of opportunities throughout the day to ask questions, and on each of the tables there should be a QR code that will help you submit your questions in advance if you haven't already done so. But please feel free, there's not that many of us in the room, so please feel free to put your hand up and we can take questions as we go along in the respective points. For those joining online, there's also an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So we very much want to hear from you as part of this. Additionally, we're also likely to take a few photos. If you're intrinsically shy and don't want your picture being used, then please let us know. If not, we will take consent as the fact that you've not put your hand up and said you prefer not to. Importantly, these events are for you to meet us at Electricity North West and to meet the team. I'm Helen Norris, I'm the Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Electricity North West, but you're here to meet our fabulous DSO team. So in the room with us today we have Paul Auckland. We don't have Cara Blockley, unfortunately, who's unable to attend today. Speaking later, we've got Paul George and Christos. Helen and Ivan, Keith are also in the room, as is Andrea and Lottie, who has helped us organise the event today. So please take the opportunities over lunch and the coffee breaks to be able to catch up with our DSO team who are here to talk to you today. Speaking today, we are very, very pleased that we have got Ben Grunfeld, who is the Director at Electricity North West, responsible for the DSO team. But particularly we've got Dr. Nina Klein, who's joining us from our regulator Ofgem. She'll be talking to us about flexibility of the DSO market from an Ofgem perspective. We've got a Q&A session after her opportunity to talk, where we'll have an opportunity to ask questions of Nina as well. We're also particularly pleased to have John Forbes from CAF joining us as well, giving the experience of somebody who's actually used our data and how they've used our data portal and what it's meant to them as a bit of a case study for you. As I said previously, we've also got Christos and Paul from our DSO team, and also Jonathan Booth talking about data within Electricity North West. So hopefully an exciting agenda for you and an informative agenda for you today. Talking of the agenda, this is the running order that we're going to go through. It's been shared with you as part of the the pre-briefing for the event, but we will be aiming to have a break at about 11:20 and then lunch and networking about 12:30, 1 o'clock. So a really packed day where hopefully we'll all get an awful lot out of it. So without further ado, introduce Ben, who can introduce the day from a DSO perspective.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. Everyone is alive. Wonderful. It's great to see so many stakeholders and partners in the room. We really appreciate your joining us today and participating in this session, but also the broader engagement that we have with you on DSO and more widely with Electricity Northwest. Our goal today is really simple. We want to try to accomplish two things. One, we want to give you an update on the progress we've made as an organization on our DSO transition journey. We started this journey several years ago. As you're probably aware, the electricity sector in the UK tends to run on regulatory cycles. Those regulatory cycles, there was an 8-year regulatory cycle, and we're now in a 5-year regulatory cycle. We finished the first year of that regulatory cycle in March of this year, and we're into the second. And we have an ambitious plan for our transition to DSO over the remainder of this regulatory period, ED2. And we'll talk to you about, again, the progress we've made, but also give you a view of what's coming, and give you a sense of where we believe it's important to invest and to focus our attention over the coming 2.5, 3.5 years. And with that, we want your input, right? We want your feedback. We want you to be part of shaping that. And so we'll talk a lot about collaboration, and we'll talk a lot about what our vision is and our ambitions are for creating the most efficient, the most dynamic, the most flexible electricity network in the UK, and importantly, a network and a set of flexibility markets that ultimately return value to you and to our stakeholders and to our communities in the Northwest, which is a really important aspect of who we at Electricity Northwest are, right? We are deeply rooted in the Northwest. We're deeply rooted in our communities. And we think that the journey to DSO and the journey to a flexible, dynamic energy sector and electricity network needs to incorporate that as well. So we'll talk about that as we go through this as well. Let me start, and I'm going to go off script a little bit here, and Helen and the team will cringe in a moment. But I wanted to start, we're going to talk a little bit about our vision of DSO and what DSO means, or I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think DSO means and what we think DSO means at Electricity Northwest. But what I wanted to do before that was just, get some feedback from the room. So don't be shy. If you have a view of an aspect of DSO or what you think DSO means, I'd like to hear it. We'd like to hear it. So if there's any volunteers, and I'll ask the NWL people to keep their hands down for a moment, because I'm sure they've got their own views, but really from stakeholders, what does DSO mean to you? What do you think DSO needs to be? What are some of the key attributes of DSO, of a DSO, or DSO that you think are important? Any volunteers? I know it's early, and I'm starting you off with the cringe part. Yeah.
A facilitator to help the transition to net zero.
Excellent, lovely. I love the word facilitator. We talk about the word orchestrator as well. Others? Yep.
Smart management of the network.
Yep. Smart, dynamic, digital. Yep. Others? Yep.
The ability to take on board harvested energy from remote places into the grid and transport it to new locations.
Yep, absolutely. Decentralized. Yep. Others? No, everyone's shy. We'll get you there eventually today, don't worry. That's great. That's really helpful. For us, DSO is fundamentally the transition from the old way of running distribution networks to the future and the new way of running distribution networks. It's in many ways all encompassing of the transition that the sector is going on as operators of electrical infrastructure, and in particular, distribution infrastructure. You talk about the last mile, right? You talk about the part of the network that really connects all the customers, all of the energy users, or certainly the vast majority of the energy users into this network. When we think about the future, right, and we think about the energy transition, it often gets characterized as encompassing the 4 Ds, right? Decarbonized, decentralized, digitalized, democratic. I'll coin a 5th just for the sake of it, and maybe it'll catch on, which is dynamic, right? The old network was static. We built it, and maybe we went back around once a year to check that it was still there, but it was static. Obviously, we did more than that, but it was static, right? The future network, the one that we're building and the one that we need to engage with the community and the stakeholders around, is much more active, dynamic, decentralized in terms of being able to harvest remote resources, harness the value of distributed energy resources, which are connecting at scale now across the network. It's decarbonized, right, which is almost standard, right, at this stage. And it's digitalized. We are monitoring the network, controlling and actively controlling the network in ways that were not fathomable 10 years ago. And DSO is about effectively driving that transition, creating that network, creating that ecosystem, and orchestrating that much more dynamic network. We don't want to control and own all of it, but we need to be able to orchestrate and engage with the broader communities and the broader stakeholders to enable that transition to happen. There's 2 parts that we're going to focus on today in that journey. The first is flexibility services. So when we think about flexibility services, or certainly when I think about flexibility services, it's about making the system and the network more democratic. How do we get more participants engaged in providing the services and providing the energy that the system needs, that the network needs? It's about becoming more decarbonized, right? Because the assets and the customers that are participating in the flexibility services markets that we're creating, and that Nina will come up and talk about more broadly across the UK, are largely decarbonized assets. It's about energy efficiency, it's about demand response, it's about batteries, it's about any sort of flexible resource that we can engage and connect to the network and can operate in a much more dynamic state. And that's the last bit. It's about making the network and the system much more dynamic than it's ever been. So we'll talk about flexibility services today a lot. And then the second one is data. And again, data is how we become a more democratic network, right? We share the information that's available. We put the information in your hands in a way that is easy to use, that provides you with the right signals, that provides you with the information that you need to be able to engage in the network and participate in this transition in a much more engaged way. And it's about digital, right? Ultimately, all of this data that we are capturing, that we want to provide access to in a safe and effective way, is digital data, fundamentally. It is, our ability to share what we have and share what we can is all enabled by the fact that it is now, ones and zeros, right? No one's going out and reading a meter and writing down a number anymore. It is much more digitalized. And so we'll talk about the journey that we're going on as an organization with you around data and sharing and making it a more accessible and easy to use environment. So those are the 2 principal topics that we'll talk about a lot today. And then finally, ultimately, and this is standard E&W fare, but it's really important, we are a collaborative organization. I talked about our being rooted in the Northwest and being engaged with stakeholders. This is about participation, working together, identifying the challenges, and being able to come up with innovative solutions that help drive us forward. As I said early on, we have tremendous ambitions around creating this dynamic and efficient and democratic network that returns value to the community and returns value to stakeholders. And we need your help to do that. And so we'll actively engage you, hopefully more than I could with my 3 questions. But appreciate you all coming. And with that, Helen, you're going to do a quick intro the next. But we really appreciate everyone being here today, and look forward to an exciting dialogue. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that, Ben. As I mentioned in the intro, we're delighted that for this DSO event we've been able to attract Nina Klein to come and talk to us very specifically about regulatory landscape, and particularly around DSO and around the flexibility markets that we're working with Ofgem and the team on here. So Nina.
And yeah, really pleased to be here today. So as Helen said, my name is Nina. I work at Ofgem in the Decentralised Energy Systems team. So I work with Marzia Zafar, everyone has come across her. So I'm here to give a whistle-stop tour, essentially, of that wider regulatory landscape that should be helping enable flexibility across the piece. So it's not lunchtime yet, but I'm essentially going to give you a sandwich. So there'll be a little of thin regulatory bread at the top, a nice juicy flexibility filling in the middle, and then a teeny little sliver of data and digitalisation bread at the bottom, because I wanted to nicely map to that flexibility and data theme that we just kind of had presented for the day. So yeah, I'll start off with a brief overview of the ED2 and ED3 regulation. Those acronyms I haven't spelled out because I'm pretty sure everyone in the room is all good with those. But from then on, your sandwich kind of becomes an acronym soup. So we'll come into the filling all around flexibility policy. I'll talk to you about the market facilitator, the flexibility digital infrastructure and the asset register in particular, and the smart secure energy systems. For me, that's the bit I know best, so save your questions for that area, please. And then I'll finish us off with a little thin sliver of data and digitalisation bread, talking you through the data best practice and the data sharing infrastructure policy. So without further ado then, as we know, we've been through that first year of ED2, and so Ofgem has now published the DSO Incentives Outcome Report. And we're really pleased to say that all of the DNOs earned a reward this year, which is great. We've seen a lot of good progress, and we're really pleased to see that DSO concept being taken and run with and really kind of implemented in practice. There was, however, like a bit of a spread in how many incentives people got, and so whilst there are a lot of really good outcomes that we're keen to celebrate, we also think that there is room to improve and keep doing that progress that we're talking about. And we think the key area there is really kind of quantification to demonstrate the benefits of DSO, which I know we're going to be talking about later, so I think really on trend, and that's great. So yeah, looking forward to seeing more progress there, even starting today. Unfortunately, Ofgem have not implemented the outturn performance metrics for ED2. It was a difficult decision, but one we had to make. But we do still think that quantitative reporting of DSO performance metrics is really important and is going to help drive further improvements in this area. So we'd really encourage you to kind of work with other DNOs and work with your stakeholders about how we can make progress there. So on to ED3, which we're already thinking about, despite only being 1 year into ED2. We are currently drafting our ED3 framework consultation, and I've been told I'm allowed to tell you it will be published in November. The last time we gave a date for publication, a general election got called literally 2 days later. So I tentatively say November. I think people in the room have even been told a day. I was only allowed to say a month. So do some networking in the break to find out some more details there. But yeah, we will be making that framework consultation publication, and then there'll be the working groups to kind of support all of the development. And just to say again, like the DSO role is very important, and it will be a key part of ED3. And I guess the kind of changes to think about and look out for is trying to make sure that we're considering DSO flexibility in a bit more of a strategic sense. And so I think that's thinking about the whole system context, so not just what does a DNO need flexibility for, but what might the whole system need flexibility for. So So thinking about how we balance DNOs using flexibility for kind of network type purposes and deferring reinforcement versus how the ESO might need access to flexibility at a distribution level for that kind of whole system balancing. So those kind of considerations. And then it would be remiss of me not to mention Clean Power 2030. That new target really is going to change what we're looking at, probably in ED2 and in ED3, to make sure we're getting through there. And I think the main message there is just pace. It's 5 years away, which is pretty swift when you're talking about large-scale engineering things, and also pretty swift when you're talking about getting new markets up and running and new participants doing things they haven't done before. So I think pace is the key message there. But we do also still have that 2050 target, and so as was kind of started already, making sure that the distribution network is that key enabler of net zero, particularly thinking about low carbon technology rollout like EVs and heat pumps. So lots to look forward to, definitely lots to keep you busy, I think. Now we get on to the filling of the sandwich, and this is the bit I like best, and I'll talk you through these kind of key policy areas. And I guess the purpose of this is, you know, DSO flexibility is all your bread and butter, but trying to give you a sense of like the bigger picture of flexibility and what's going on, so you can see how you can play that part in that wider strategic context. So I hope that's kind of helpful today. So first of all, I'll talk you through the market facilitator policy area. And essentially it's a new institutional role that Ofgem have created, and it's going to be delivered by Elexon. And really what that institution is responsible for is standardising across the DSO flexibility markets, and also making sure that those DSO markets align with the ESO flexibility markets. And so one of the key things is ensuring that the DSOs and ESO are going to be required to adopt those outputs that the market facilitator creates in concert with you guys as stakeholders. And another key aspect, of course, is making sure that there's a good governance mechanism for Ofgem and this market facilitator entity to make sure that we're really embedding accountability and delivery into the process. So 2023 was when we kind of first confirmed that we were going to create this new role of a market facilitator institution. And then just this year we confirmed that Elexon was going to be the body taking on the responsibility for that role. So now we're really trying to make sure that we roll out and deliver that new role. And that kind of covers 3 areas. So first of all, thinking about detailed design, you know, what are the functions and roles that that market facilitator is going to be responsible for delivering, but also what is that kind of governance framework to make sure we're holding it accountable for delivering those functions. And we've been doing a lot of stakeholder workshops, so thank you to anyone who's come along to those to share views. Then we're also trying to make sure that we implement at pace. And what that means is we need to have the regulatory and legal framework to actually give Elexon that new role. And so we've been working with the Association of Decentralised Energy on a modification to extend Elexon's fire reuse. And then finally, transition is really important to make sure that we've got a smooth handover from a lot of the work that Open Networks project has been doing, standardising the DSO markets, and making sure that there's a transition without any kind of loss of momentum over to this new institution in Elexon. And so Elexon are now taking on the chair of Open Networks, which is really good, and they've been joining the technical working group. So hopefully, kind of in some of those day-to-day places, you're seeing that transition start to happen already, and we hope it will continue at pace. So continuing at pace, our forward plan is that we're going to have a consultation coming out soon on sort of the policy framework, thinking about the roles the market facilitator will perform, and also that governance arrangement, and we'll also be making a decision on that BSC modification. Then kind of into 2025, we'll be making sure that the governance arrangements are actually in place. So we'll need a second BSC modification and a governance framework document to accompany that. And then crucially also we'll be consulting on changes to the DNO license and the NESO license to make sure that when the market facilitator does produce these outputs of more standardized ways of doing things, there's a license requirement on the DNOs and the ESA to actually adopt and implement those ways of doing things. So really making sure there's accountability built into the licensing framework. And so, yeah, we want the market facilitator to be fully up and running by the end of 2025, but we don't want to kind of wait for that. We're really starting early with that smooth transition, and Elexon kind of starting to take in those bits of the Open Networks project. So that's kind of all in full swing. If anyone wants to ask a detailed question about the market facilitator, there's a slide I'll show you later. So if you want to understand how it interacts with other players in the space, let me know and I can flick back to that. But for now, we'll come on to the middle of the sandwich, which is the flexibility, digital infrastructure, and particularly the asset registration piece. So the flexibility digital infrastructure, or FDI, is another policy area which is all about trying to make sure we maximise the participation of these smaller, more distributed assets like EVs and heat pumps in domestic settings, making sure that they can participate at scale in flexibility markets. And so what we're trying to do there is address kind of key market entry barriers by having coordinated digital infrastructure across the piece, across these different flexibility markets at local and national levels, so ESO and DSO. And the kind of key barriers we were seeing is like there's a lack of transparent information, the market providers can't see the assets can't clearly see what all the different market opportunities are. There's also a lack of coordinated access to markets, like how easy and streamlined is it to get into the markets? And then once you're in the market, how well coordinated are they between ESO and DSO? And then finally, across the piece, like lack of trusted governance if there aren't kind of the right institutional structures and common digital tools. So we kind of have been looking at a range of potential outcomes that this digital infrastructure could support delivering, and also kind of what key underpinning enablers you need in place first, because you can't just kind of hit things with a magic digital stick and everything works. If you haven't got a standardized process, you can't have a standard digital process. And so it's really important to do that kind of pre-work first. So going over to the diagram, yes, my pointer does work. The kind of key outcomes that we think are going to be needed as part of this digital infrastructure piece are underpinning, as I said, you have to have those data standards and that commonly agreed IT architecture, and you're going to need kind of compliance tools to support it. But making sure there's a first point where users can register, and then a key thing as well being that registration of assets, so you can clearly see what assets are out there and what their technical capabilities are. Then you also want to have a register of different types of markets. What are the entry requirements? What are the metering requirements? And then you can imagine that once you've got your list of assets and your list of markets, you can then do automatic pre-qualification of assets that are compatible with the market requirements. And then once you've got them in the markets, then you need your ESO, DSO coordination. And I guess the point is that by having a coordinated and common approach to these digital tools, we think it will streamline processes and lower costs and make it easier for these smaller assets to get into markets. We first kind of said, we think this is a good idea, back in 2023 when we published a paper on this general area. And we have since undertaken policy development through various workshops and industry exercises. Again, thank you to anyone who's been to some of our working groups. They're really interesting. And it just helps us get that kind of detail as to what our users really want from these kinds of policy areas. And so where we've got to now is that we think a kind of key first step for policy intervention is that registration of assets and making sure that's done in a common way. And as I said, that pre-work of those underpinning enablers first. So that's why we've highlighted in green the registration of assets and the underpinning enablers. And so what we've done is this summer we published a consultation on that flexibility market asset registration that also called out the importance of enablers. And so we're kind of busy analysing the responses for that now. I'm going to treat myself to a detail slide and explain a little bit more about what that flexibility market asset register could look like, because I do think it's particularly relevant to DSO markets and getting these smaller assets into DSO markets. So basically, a common piece of digital infrastructure, really the foundation is standardized data exchanges, and we would like them to follow the data sharing infrastructure approach. That's a bit of a spoiler alert. I'll tell you a bit more about data sharing infrastructure in a moment, but really it's about having a common piece of digital infrastructure that can collect data, store that data, and then provide access to that data. And particularly for the flexibility market point of view, we think that you're going to need to have a collection interface, both at the point that an asset might enter an ESO market, or at the point where it might enter a DSO market. And those collection interfaces need to be common and consistent. Obviously, we think you could also have an anytime interface. You know, maybe people want to put an asset in later or earlier than the point of market entry, so that should be supported. We then think there needs to be a way of commonly storing the data, and whilst there is one giant orange blob there, that doesn't have to mean all your data is centrally stored. It might be stored in a more distributed or decentralized way, but conceptually, a common and interoperable way of storing data is important. And then we need an interface where people can access that data. So if an EV, first of all, gets registered into an ESO market, but then later wants to go into a DSO market, the DSO should be able to go in and access that data that was originally captured by the ESO, for example. So that's kind of conceptually what the digital infrastructure could do. And what we said in our consultation was we've got a minded to position that the market facilitator should convene working groups to think about the kind of design of this digital infrastructure. They're already essentially tasked with doing the enabling work. That's part of their institutional role. But we think they should have working groups to design in a bit more detail what this infrastructure could look like, particularly like what data is in scope or out of scope. Again, ask me questions if you like. And that was something we were clear about, the design stage. But in terms of like the delivery and deployment stage, we don't have a minded to position yet. We listed kind of 5 options for who could build and maintain this infrastructure. Commercial, it could just come through. We don't think that's too likely. We think maybe the DSOs could own it. We think maybe the ESO could own it. Maybe the market facilitator could own it. Or maybe we give it to some other existing formal entity in the energy sector like Electrolink or the DCC or GemServe, someone like that. So that's a bit more detail on what the asset register could look like. Interested to hear how you think that might support DSO flexibility markets. And then I guess, yeah, we'll be doing a response to that consultation as to what our kind of next steps for policy intervention are early next year. And I just wanted to do a call out across the bottom to this blue area. We're working really closely with DESNZ and their Net Zero Innovation Portfolio, NZIP, to support kind of 2 key innovation projects in this area. Both of them are going to be finishing by Q2 2025, and so they're just kind of getting into the demonstration phase. So please do engage with them if you see them kind of running stakeholder workshops. The first one is automatic asset registration, or AAR, and that's all about a program to develop a technical solution that can automatically register assets when they're installed, and then store that data in a central asset register, which would make it a lot easier for DNOs to see the kind of assets being connected to their network and plan their network going forward and know what assets are available for flexibility services. And then the second one is the Flexibility Markets Unlocked program, and that again is about technical digital solution across flexibility markets to improve standardization and coordination. So we're keeping a close eye on both of those to kind of get relevant learnings to take forward in policy. Now we're on to a policy area called Smart Secure Energy Systems. This is probably the one that's most tangential, but I still think is interesting for you to know about kind of developments in the wider space. And this is all about the fact that we are going to have more of these electric vehicles, heat pumps, batteries being installed in people's homes. And so what we're going to expect is those, we call those energy smart appliances, or ESAs. And we expect them to be offering demand side response, what you guys call flexibility services, to the energy system. And so what we're going to have is we're going to have new entities out there load controlling, turning up and down, export, import of these new assets. And whilst that creates a lot of really good opportunities to have more flexibility on the system, it also means there's going to be more risks around consumer protection if they're participating in these new services. Grid stability, can we rely on these assets to respond when we tell them to? And of course, cybersecurity, we're going to be doing mass digital communication to distributed assets all across the UK, and we want to make sure that that is safe for the critical national infrastructure of the energy system. So Smart Secure Energy Systems, or SES, is essentially a new regulatory regime that's looking to protect against these risks, while also kind of making sure we support the opportunities and growth in this market by making sure consumers can be more confident and new entrants can come in a standardised way. It's looking across 3 areas. So first of all, it's going to be creating a load control licence. Essentially, the people you think of as aggregators, we're creating a new licensing regime. So in the same way a supplier is a licensed supplier, an aggregator will soon have to be a licensed aggregator, which can support consumer protection as well as kind of protecting the grid. We're also looking at making sure tariff data is interoperable, again, should support more flexibility services. And then finally, we're going to be putting regulations on those energy smart appliances, so making sure EVs and heat pumps are following technical standards so they can provide flexibility in a common way and there's interoperable communication to the device. And I guess to try and explain how they fit into the picture is that, yeah, these EVs, heating technologies and battery storages will be being operated by these load controllers, as we're calling them, that will be licensed. And they'll be using those assets in your DSO flexibility services, in the ESO market, and in the wholesale market or the capacity market. So that's how they're going to be interfacing with you. And this is kind of like new and groundbreaking. We didn't have the power to regulate aggregators before, but now we do. The Energy Act in 2023 gave us this new power because we're seeing these new entrants emerge into the energy sector. And so Ofgem is now working with DESNZ to draft these new license conditions. So we'll have this new load controller license. And we're also, as I said, working on tariff interoperability in the regulation of appliances. And I actually worked on those appliance regulations like back when I was in business. So it's been really delightful to say back in my day to some of my colleagues, and I feel very, very old, which I don't normally have the opportunity to do. So that's been quite entertaining. Where we're going next is a consultation package. I think every single one I've said of where we're going next is a consultation package. So I think that's a bit of the theme of how we do things and how we make decisions. But again, hopefully next year, consulting on what that license should look like, what those technical standards should be. And in terms of timeline, we're trying to make sure that people will be able to apply for the license by mid-2026, and the regime will be in effect from 2027. And again, for the device standards, there's kind of is making sure we have minimum requirements by 2026, 2027, and then making sure that we've got kind of designated standards by 2028, 2029. Again, a deep dive slide that I won't do now, but is there if you want it. So we've made it to the final bit of bread, and we'll just overview quickly kind of data and digitalization, because as you kind of said, like flexibility doesn't work unless it's underpinned by the data and digital tools that make it possible. So I will talk you through different kinds of data, and I think it's helpful to have the framing of there's some kinds of data that are completely open, some kinds of data that can only be shared between appropriate parties, and then some kinds of data that are completely closed and it wouldn't be appropriate to share outside your organizational boundaries. And so for that kind of data that is open data, we have this policy area called data best practice. For the kind of data that is that shared data, maybe between just a couple of organizations with the right credentials, that's what the data sharing infrastructure policy is all about. And for that closed data, it's closed, so we just let people do whatever they do with that. So open data, data best practice. Really, data best practice is our main tool for creating standards and interoperability for this data, making it more discoverable and open. And it's trying to embed that like data as a culture kind of approach to the energy sector. It has 11 key principles, and one of the most important one is that energy system data should be presumed open. That doesn't mean all energy system data is open. It means that energy system data should go through a data triage process, and then hopefully can be, if it goes through that process and is fine, then it can be open. And so that means more data across the energy sector can be open and used. And really what we're trying to achieve here in the vision is trying to get data out of those existing silos to make sure we can improve efficiency across the sector, collaboration, innovation, all of that good stuff. And so data best practice guidance has been out there already for network licensees. DNOs have been doing great things. You've all got data portals, and that's wonderful. And so now what we want to do is expand that across industry codes and new regimes to other actors in the sector. Because really, the more data you have from the more sources out there, you get more insights, more services become available, and you can drive more value from that data. So that's where we see it going. So yeah, in terms of implementation, we're going to be rolling it into codes. There's some new regimes around CCUS, heat networks, and SES, like we talked about, and we'll be making sure suppliers and generators are also captured in these things. So we've got a working group already now. If you're not on it, let me know if you want to be on it, and I'll get you on it. And we'll be, surprise, consulting again about how to put data best practice into the codes. And so yes, consultations and decisions will be ongoing. I think that's the Ofgem tagline. Final slide. For that shared data, we have this thing called the data sharing infrastructure. And just to be really clear, what it is it's a decentralized technical solution. We're not creating a giant big database, one for the whole energy system that everyone dips into. We know that existing companies have their data. What we want to do is make sure it is more shareable from that existing company. So decentralized, you have control of your data, but there is more access to it, so that people can exchange data in a much more standardized and secure way. And the way that you do that, there's kind of three key components. First of all, you need a trust framework, that's shown in green. And that's really saying, who can you trust to access your data, who is authorized to access it? Then you need a preparation mechanism, that's shown in blue, and that's all about standardizing the data so it's in a nice interoperable format. And then you need the actual sharing mechanism. How do you exchange and communicate that data with someone else? And that's shown in red. So that's what a data sharing infrastructure is. But really what it does is it means that data can be exchanged in that consistent format between trusted parties. And what that does is it prevents all these complex individual legal arrangements that you have to have. It reduces data sharing costs, and it should improve data quality across the energy system. So what we really want to do is kind of streamline that sharing of that more restricted, shared only data. And we think that can support a lot of different use cases, so really helpful for flexibility. I kind of gave that example earlier, can support a lot of innovation, can help with the resilience and stability of the system, and of course, going to be absolutely key to reaching net zero in a coordinated way. In terms of implementation, we've kind of set out an architecture for how we think DESNZ and Ofgem will interact with stakeholders, and that we'll need kind of interim and enduring coordinators for this common digital tool. And so we consulted on what the governance arrangements should be like over the summer this year. And we had a minority position that NESO should be the interim DSI coordinator. And we need to think a bit more, and we'll do subsequent consultations on who an enduring coordinator could be. But we're not just talking about governance, there's also delivery happening. And so NESO are currently delivering a pilot version of this, particularly focusing on how data can be exchanged to support outage planning. And next year, NESO will be delivering an MVP version of it, thinking about the use case of strategic planning. So that's data sharing infrastructure. Thank you very much. I hand to Helen to say how much time we've got left for Q&A, because that was a lot of content. I hope it was interesting.
Thank you very much, Nina. We do have about 10 or so minutes for Q&A, and you've been quite busy sending questions through, which is fantastic. So just to kind of get things warmed up, I will start with a couple that have come through already. Sorry, age means I've got to do that. So Nina, what steps is Ofgem taking to ensure that flexibility markets are accessible to smaller providers, including community and local energy groups?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I think you're going to see a lot more talk about community and local energy going forward. One of government's kind of key commitments and new initiatives was the local power plan, and they're talking a lot about investing money in community and local energy schemes. So I think there's going to be an increased prioritisation on that going forward. I think the key initiatives that we've been looking at across Ofgem, a lot of them do really support those smaller assets, because I think that's where we see that we know that the ramp up is going to start happening, and we want to start laying the groundwork to make sure they can get into these markets at scale. And the kind of challenges they face are quite different to the bigger ones. It's kind of a scale problem. So anything you can do to streamline processes will really help. And so I think that market facilitator work around standardising the DSO markets, but also aligning them with ESO, the more and more similar a market is, the easier it is for you to do hundreds of thousands of assets into them. If you've only got one asset, figuring out 3 different markets, fine. If you've got hundreds of thousands, doing each one in a slightly different way is very complicated. So I think the coordination and streamlining there really helps. And particularly that flexibility market asset register really was thinking with these EVs and these heat pumps in mind. We've talked to stakeholders, and they're uploading individual PDFs for individual assets to get into certain markets that I shall not name. And I don't think any of us think that's a sustainable approach for every EV in the country. So how can we make sure there's more common and coordinated tools, particularly when it's hundreds of thousands of assets, which these smaller assets will be. And I think as well, the smart secure energy systems, by having technical standards that these assets follow, that's a really key way of making sure there's consistent ways for them to get into markets. So yes, the policy work we're doing should help.
Fabulous. That's hopefully given the people in the room a chance to decide whether they've got any further questions. I have 1 or 2 still on my little magic pad. But if there are any questions in the room for Nina, this is your opportunity to pop your hand up. If not, I'll go. Oh, here we go. Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned in the presentation about licensing aggregators in the future. If I read it correctly, consultation 2025 moving to 2026 for implementation. Is that realistic?
Okay, this is our Smart Secure Energy Systems programme. Yeah, so I guess those are our current timelines that we would like to keep to. I think particularly with that 2030 target in mind, things do need to happen at pace. And so we are trying to deliver on all of those. So yeah, we had a consultation earlier this summer where we talked about kind of what the scope of that license should be and who might be falling into scope of it and what kind of conditions it would need to have. And so we're working now to draft up the policy positions for what those conditions should contain. and working on that license drafting. So yeah, our intent currently is to have a consultation in 2025 on some of the detail of what will be in that license. And yeah, we're starting to put in place what would be needed internally within Ofgem to be able to manage and administer that new licensing regime with an intent to open in mid-2026, so that we can be granting and have licenses in effect from 2027. I hope we can deliver that, because I think that's what the energy system needs. Obviously, we'll see how that goes, but yeah, best intents, certainly.
Does that lead to suggest then that unlicensed aggregators will not be able to participate in the future?
So I give a really nuanced answer about what the licensing does and doesn't cover. So what the licensing specifically covers is this light blue kind of functionality called load controller. So if you as an entity are controlling through remote signals, turning up and turning down, shifting in time, devices like EVs, heating and battery in people's homes, those kinds of activities you will not be allowed to undertake unless you have an aggregator license. And there's also this dark blue thing called being a DSR service provider. And essentially that's, I should probably have a little, this is terrible not to have a consumer on the slide as Ofgem, there should probably be a little picture of a consumer here, because the DSR service provider bit is the bit that has the contract with the consumer and is taking consumer preferences and is making sure that the financial, the rewards that consumers are being paid and stuff like that are there. And so the consumer protection stuff is more the dark blue side, and the asset technical stuff is more the light blue side. So if you have a relationship with a consumer for flexibility, yes, you will have to be licensed to do that. What we don't cover is what the rules are for getting into a DSO, ESO, or a wholesale market. That won't be something that we license. But for example, to get into a wholesale market as an aggregator, P415 recently allowed them access, and they will have to become licensed. License isn't the right word. They'll have to apply to become a virtual trading party, a VTP. So that will cover them for that. There's not currently a kind of concept of what kind of party you have to be in an ESO or DSO market. It's just as long as you meet the entry rules, you're in. But it might be interesting in terms of talking about standardising and harmonising across markets. Like, could there be a common type of application process you go to get qualified as an entity allowed into ESO and DSO markets, so that then I don't have to qualify as an entity first for the ESO market and then for the DSO market? Like, I qualify once and that lets me into both. Maybe that's an interesting area for us to think a little bit more about. That feels kind of market facilitator type thinking to me. Does that clarify what you will have to be licensed to do and what you won't have to be licensed but will still have to meet market entry requirements for?
It helps enormously, and thank you. And my observation was, when you've got on your ESA, there's a massive shift coming forward now in domestic, putting solar on roofs and having batteries on premises, which is going to trigger on your dark blue and your light blue. And that's a huge growth market coming forward, which takes the pressure off the grid, which is great for the grid, not so good for electricity northwest. You won't be able to build them, but there we are.
Well, that's why we think that when you put these things in people's homes, you should be thinking about what flexibility they can provide to kind of balance that and support. And if you've got any ideas in the break about how we can do this faster, always happy to.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Brilliant. That actually possibly leads me nicely, Helen, I'll come back to you. That possibly leads me nicely to a question that actually came in, which is, has Ofgem considered incentive or policies to encourage non-traditional participants, such as households, EV owners, small businesses, etc., to engage with flexibility markets?
First part of the question again, incentives or policies, something like that. Yeah, non-traditional. Oh, so they think non-traditional is households and EV owners. Yes. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So I think the kind of questioner makes an interesting point around, aggregation flexibility has been around for a while, but it has traditionally been more from like medium-sized and larger loads, industrial and commercial settings, big chillers, a lot of agribusiness kind of stuff. And so now we are seeing, as you say, like people in their homes getting these low carbon technologies, which I was going to say in an ideal world, but I think in a practical and realistic world need to be flexible in order for the energy system to kind of reasonably be able to manage and incorporate them at an appropriate cost, which all consumers will be paying to a greater or lesser extent. And so I think that's why you can see kind of our policy programme of work does quite a lot to support making sure that these smaller assets, we are kind of trying to set the policy groundwork so that there's the right systems and standards and institutions in place to let them go into markets. But I guess this is where a lot of the questions are Ofgem focused because I'm the one stood on the stage, but the DSOs and the ESO are the ones actually running these markets. And so whilst we can say, we think these smaller assets are important and you need to be opening up your markets to them, you folks in industry are the ones who are going to be doing the legwork of removing barriers in markets that, whilst they were designed to be technology neutral, were designed at a time when there was only certain types of technologies out there, and so what your realm of possibility was probably wasn't as broad as the type of technologies out there now. And so thinking about, the operational metering requirements you have, are they really necessary, or are they just what the technology at the time was easily capable of doing? Can we think about what would give equivalent standards of assurance but would be more easily achievable for these smaller assets? So whilst I think we're putting the enabling policy environment in place, and very happy to hear if there's things you think where we're missing something, or there's a gap, or there's something we need to be doing to support bringing these things forward more, very happy to hear it. And also really keen to kind of see that change on the ground in terms of making sure market requirements and rules and sequencing of markets and stacking is set up to really support these smaller assets being able to get into them because they are newer.
Lovely, thanks ever so much, Nina. Helen, did you have a question?
I did. You've talked about standardising sort of data and things being able to talk to each other, but is there any plans that you're aware of for standardising things like home energy management systems and the consumer resources that go into homes? So they've got standardised firmware and API, so anybody can talk to them with their own sort of technology, because we've been working on an innovation project and all home energy management systems have their different systems. We can't just connect into them sort of proprietary. So I just wondered if there's any plans to standardise that to make all of this much easier.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question to the question just to check I've understood. Yeah. So when you say home energy management systems, you very specifically mean one system that works across all the LCTs in the house to optimise across both an EV and a heat pump and a solar. You don't mean just the EV or just the heat pump.
Yeah, precisely, and it might speak to an aggregator, which could be a community aggregator.
Whole home, yeah. I think my answer is going to be I should follow up with a colleague on that one. But I think broadly speaking, what we are definitely doing is standardising the EV and the heat pump and the battery system. By those having a technical standard that's interoperable should mean they can then more easily speak to that HEMS system. Interesting though, the HEMS system itself, its business model is being able to speak to many devices. So in some ways, there's already a business incentive to be driving that standardisation, and therefore I think historically there's been less of a case for policy intervention in that space because there's already a natural incentive for it. But I can follow up with a colleague as to any specifics in that area. It's a great question.
And one final question, which will lead us nicely into our next speaker, is how important is data transparency to the success of flexibility markets, and what role does Ofgem see for better data sharing between DNOs, DSOs and flexibility providers?
Yes, I'm really excited to see the presentations later today from your DSO team about kind of what data you are sharing and with you and what kind of insights that's driving, because I think a lot of the evidence does come from on the ground, and you have had a year and there has been a lot of really interesting developments and stuff on data portals, so I think that's really good. And I guess kind of that's stuff we've shown around what our intent is with data is that where possible data should be presumed open, and so DNOs should be doing that work to put things on data portals after that triage process. But even then we appreciated that wasn't quite going far enough, because there is some data that might be very specific and can't be more widely shared, but is something that a flexibility service provider and a DNO do need to be sharing together. So hopefully data sharing infrastructure supports that. And again, specifically did have that flexibility market asset register, which I think is a really clear example where a flexibility service provider has a piece of data that they might want to share with multiple parties. And so we are thinking from a policy point of view about what common tools across the sector might need to be put in place. And that's where I think you really can point a finger at Ofgem as opposed to an individual company, because as a company, you're there to do what's right for your company. And I think there are now incentives for whole system approaches and stuff. But I think we as Ofgem, a lot of the value we add to the energy sector is driving coordination across companies. And so I think that's why a lot of the things you see me present, the word like coordination or commonality or common or standardized is there, because I think that's where we're really trying to drive and add value. So yes, data transparency is very important, and hopefully we're helping you help yourselves as well.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Nina. It's been really interesting to have you here with us today. We're absolutely delighted. If we have a round of applause for Nina. had a question about whether the slides are going to be made available afterwards. Yes, I can confirm that they will do, so you don't need to worry too much about trying to scribble everything down, particularly Nina's quite complex slides. And I have had a little peek at John's, and there's a couple of complex ones in here as well. So without further ado, to welcome John Forbes to the stage. So he's project manager at Zero Carbon Cumbria and wants to talk to us about how we've actually used the data that we provide as well. So John, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you all, both here in the room and those of you who are joining online. And thank you very much to Electricity North West for the opportunity to talk to you today about how we are using the electricity and other data. I actually work for Cumbria Action for Sustainability, and I'm the project manager for the Zero Carbon Cumbria project, which is funded by the National Lottery. So after a brief introduction, I'll explain how we're using the data from Electricity North West and other sources in aspects of this project, in the analysis of our baseline emissions, how we're using that data to inform our decision making in terms of the priorities for emission reduction, how it's being used by our 4 emission sector groups, and how we will use it to track progress. And I'll finish by outlining a new opportunity that we would like to use the data in the future. So Cumbria Action for Sustainability, and it's great to see you all here in Cumbria because we are an environmental charity based in Penrith. We employ around 40 people, and we run a variety of sustainability projects, helping householders, communities, and increasingly businesses. We provide advice and information on the various carbon saving opportunities and help them on that journey from idea to implementation. We work with a wide range of partners, including both of the local authorities, Westmoreland and Furness Council, Cumberland Council, and also a range of other organisations, including Electricity North West. Our Chief Executive, Karen Mitchell, is on the Environment and Sustainability Advisory Panel for Electricity North West. She's also the co-chair of the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership. And this is a partnership of around 80 organisations from the community, public and private sector who've come together to work on a shared objective of a net zero Cumbria by 2037. Some of our key principles, and it was great to hear in Ben's initial presentation that he emphasised the importance of both collaboration and leadership. And these are key principles for the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership because we recognise that by working together we're more likely to achieve our objective. And that's zero carbon by 2037, to deliver this objective in a way which maximises the wider benefits, the benefits for communities, the benefits to the low carbon economy. And you might be interested to know that Innovate UK recently did some research which showed that a place-based approach to net zero is likely to lead to optimising these wider benefits: health, new business opportunities, jobs in the supply chain, and improved competitiveness of businesses. So that's our ambition. So how are we going to achieve that? So this next slide outlines the approach. And data is important to us in all aspects of this approach. We've used the data to help us assess our baseline emissions and then use it to help us determine which should be the priorities for action, and also to help us to develop the proposed trajectories which will get us to net zero by 2037. This then informs the work of our 4 sector groups who've been developing detailed emission reduction action plans, and these complement the local authority plans and the plans by the Lake District National Park, who are one of our key stakeholders. These emission reduction action plans will also form the core of our decarbonisation plan for Cumbria. And that will include the other emissions, but also some of the key enablers to support the implementation of the actions. One of those enablers is around finance, but also a really key one is the development of the infrastructure, particularly the electricity infrastructure, covering a lot of the things that we've just heard about from Nina. And clearly data will be important for us as we track progress. So to look at these in a bit more detail, we've commissioned Small World Consulting, who are based at Lancaster University, to help us assess our baseline emissions for Cumbria. And they used over 30 sources of data, including the data from Electricity North West. in helping us understand the different footprints. And it's quite an interesting challenge. What are the footprints associated with a geographic area, such as Cumbria? I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. What we also then did is to work out from those emissions, what would our priority areas be, and what would be our trajectory to net zero. And to work out the trajectories for what consulting, you particularly use the 6 carbon budget and the pathways. So it's actually been very helpful for us to use the scenarios from Electricity Northwest to sense check the proposed trajectories. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So to look at the emissions analysis in a bit more detail, this slide shows some of the footprints for Cumbria. These are calculated on a consumption basis, so they take account of both the emissions produced in Cumbria, but also the emissions associated with the upstream supply chains. You can see on the left here, emissions associated with residents, visitors, and then industry, both the production emissions in Cumbria and also with their supply chains. Land use, as I'm sure you're aware, is an interesting area because we both have sources of emissions there, but also sinks, particularly in terms of trees and improved soil health. And then on the right-hand side here, you see the emissions associated with roads, and some of those obviously will be resident and visitor and business travel. But it also includes the emissions associated with a lot of vehicles which actually just pass through Cumbria. And just as a bit of light relief, it does occur to us actually one way we could reduce that footprint would be to put a big sign on the M6 saying, if you're traveling to Scotland, please could you go by the A1 rather than the M6. But on a more serious note, let's have a look at some of these in a bit more detail. So this slide shows the residence footprint. You see up in the top right there, actually the amount of emissions from household electricity, relatively small proportion. And I think that represents or reflects a lot of the success that we've already had in decarbonising the electricity grid. But you see significant emissions associated with household fuel and also with travel, and also significant emissions with food and drink. And that one might be a little bit of a surprise to you, but that's because of the consumption-based approach that we have taken. And a lot of those emissions associated with the initial production and processing of food. Compare Cumbria average per capita footprint in Cumbria with the rest of the UK. Cumbria is around about 10% higher, and the main reasons for that are to do with vehicle fuel use. We're a remote rural area, so higher per capita use of vehicle fuel, and also you can see at the bottom there, household fuel. We expect that that's because we have more properties than average which are off the gas grid, and also a lot of older traditional properties. The visitor footprint, you can see that's dominated by travel. And we're often asked, why do we include the emissions associated with visitor travel to and from Cumbria? And one of the reasons for that is this is an area where we can influence. And a good example of that is that it's imperative of developing the infrastructure for EV charging within Cumbria, so that people who are travelling to Cumbria would be encouraged to use electric vehicles because they'd be confident that when they get to Cumbria, they'll be able to recharge the vehicles. So the vehicle emissions, or the emissions associated with travel to and from Cumbria, are very important for us in an area where we may not be able to control, but we can influence. Looking at the emissions from businesses, this next slide shows the combined Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, so the production and the upstream supply chain emissions. Not surprisingly, perhaps dominated by manufacturing and extraction. So all of that analysis of the initial footprints, I'll come back to this slide briefly. So having done that, looked at the visitors, the residents and business footprints. Small World Consulting then identified some areas which would be priority. And that priority is based around the ones we can control and influence. So looking at that in a bit more detail, this next slide shows some of those priority emissions. On the left-hand side, you see the emissions associated with energy use in buildings. That's both domestic and non-domestic. You then have the emissions associated with travel, residents, visitors, businesses, and also the embedded energy associated with the vehicles used by householders and visitors. Again, you see significant emissions associated with food and drink, and that's for residents and visitors. and then some emissions associated with different aspects of land use. And these all fit with the 4 emission sector groups, with one exception, which is the industrial process emissions on the right-hand side there. And the reason we don't have a sector group for that sector is that we're aware of a lot of work which has been done by the NEP and now Enterprise in Cumbria, working with those energy-intensive businesses. And they're often working within their trade associations to decarbonise anyway. And then the next task that Small World Consulting did was to put together the trajectory which will allow us to achieve net zero by 2037. And you can see from this graph that it's going to require a very significant reduction in the emissions as well as an increase in the sequestration, so that by 2037 we're going to achieve net zero. And like Nina was saying, it's a real challenge for us to increase both the scale and the pace of decarbonisation. And the scale of that challenge is shown on this next slide. Particularly point out here that for buildings, we've got to achieve over 95% reduction in emissions by 2037, and for travel, over 90%. So this data and this analysis form the starting point for the work of our 4 sector groups. And each sector group has put together an emission reduction pathway and then a detailed action plan showing how we can get to net zero, or at least their contribution to our overall objective of net zero. And each sector group has identified strategic priorities, and then within each strategic priority, high-level actions, and then under each high-level action, various sub-actions. So just have a quick look at some of the strategic priorities. This first slide shows the priorities for buildings. I'm sure not a surprise to you that our first objective is trying to minimize energy consumption within the home and other buildings, but then that switch from fossil fuels to heat pumps or other forms of renewable energy heating, and also to maximize the opportunities for domestic scale generation of renewables, PV panels particularly. Clearly, these are really important in relation to developments in electricity markets have been discussed earlier. Similarly with transport, it's really important for us that we can decarbonise transport, and that will include a priority around switching to EV vehicles, not just for domestic cars, but for buses and other forms of public transport, as well as reducing the need for travel and promoting active travel. In consumption, we're following the waste hierarchy as you would expect, avoiding the emissions if we can, and then reduce, reuse, and recycle. And in terms of farming and other land use, I just want to highlight here is the importance of sort of reducing the emissions associated with the use of vehicles in agriculture, buildings, and also maximising opportunities for on-farm renewables. And as I said, each of these priorities sitting beneath them are high-level actions, and then over 200 sub-actions. And we were delighted that earlier this year we held our first Zero Carbon Summit. And it was a really successful event. It brought together 85 stakeholders from communities, businesses, the public sector. And we invited them to contribute to the work of the partnership by asking them to sign up to be involved and to help with any of the different individual actions. An important point to note here is that over 75% of the actions, we had over at least 2 organisations, which shows the importance of facilitating that collaboration and helping the coordination of action to help us decarbonise. We're already in the early stages of planning next year's summit, and the provisional date, I think, is 6th of March next year, and we're hoping to hold it here in the North Lakes Hotel. How we've used specifically some of the Electricity Northwest data. And this is an example of some of the data that they shared. These scenarios are particularly interesting for us. And this is an example of the number of heat pumps by 2037 domestic sector. You can see quite a range in terms of uptake by 2037, depending on the different scenario. And I don't think it would surprise you to realise, as we're ambitious at Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, we are on a line with the leading the way. Our target is 170,000 by 2037 heat pumps or other renewable systems, but we do envisage that the vast majority of those will be heat pumps. And this slide also helps to illustrate the challenges that we face in scaling up the installation of heat pumps. We've obviously got to engage householders and social landlords across Cumbria. We need to make sure that we develop the supply chain, and that's a particular challenge for us, so that there are good quality installers able to install the heat pumps in the right way in the right buildings. But also we recognise that this has to be supported by investment in the grid infrastructure itself and the other investments in developing the electricity market. And one of the others, this leads me nicely to the next slide, which is one of the other scenarios. Information, I've looked at 3 of the scenarios which look at the total electricity in Cumbria and how this might change over the next 10 to 15 years. I mentioned in the last slide that our ambitions will align with the sort of leading the way scenarios, and it's absolutely key for us that we do decarbonise electricity. So you can see here, even at the moment, we have that 3 million megawatt hours. We need to decarbonise that by 2037. That might have doubled, and clearly it's not just the 3 million now, but all of that 6 million will need to be decarbonised. So this really emphasises to us the importance of renewables, whether domestic, community and large-scale renewables, in helping to ensure that we have a decarbonised grid. But also the difference between those figures helps us to understand the challenges that an organisation like Electricity North West face in the investment decisions that they have to make. And they have to have confidence in our objectives. So our priority is to take forward our emission reduction action plans so that we can put together a series of projects which have got strong business cases which can justify the investment required, so that we can be on the leading the way trajectory rather than certainly avoiding the falling short. Then one of the other areas, we are putting together a basket of indicators by which we will track progress across the whole of the emission reduction action plans. And there are 5 of the indicators which directly relate or will use the data which is available through the data portal, as I've shown on the slide here. So this will be important for us both in terms of tracking progress and helping to inform any actions we may need to take to accelerate if we're falling short. And also just to point out here as well, very grateful to Electricity North West, because they've also, as well as showing the data for the 2 unitary authorities, they have shown the also cut the data to the Lake District National Park area, who are one of our key stakeholders. Just in terms of the final slide here, one of the new opportunities we're looking at is that the data which is available from Electricity North West gives us really good energy use data on a geographic basis. We've also been working with Climate Outreach and the Centre for Sustainable Energy, who have looked at Climate Outreach, a climate communication specialist, and they have been looking at some customer segmentation which is widely used across the UK, developed by More in Common. And they've looked at how each of those groups respond to different climate messages and messengers. So there's an opportunity for us, and they've then mapped that across Cumbria. And that helps us understand which are the most popular segments in different geographies within Cumbria. And we do have some quite distinctive different groupings. So this provides us with the opportunity to combine the energy information with information around properties, so from EPC certificates and other sources, and also this consumer information. And if we can combine that all together, hopefully we'll be more effective in rolling out the campaigns to encourage the uptake of heat pumps. And in the spirit of collaboration and partnership, we're very willing to share this consumer information. So if any of you are involved in communications with householders and the general public, please do get in touch if you'd like to find out more. And also in the spirit of collaboration as well, obviously we're trying to facilitate collaboration within Cumbria, but increasingly outside Cumbria as well. Other partners, other organisations who are facing similar challenges, particularly those associated with remote rural communities. I appreciate that a lot of you here, maybe from other parts of the Northwest, but do get in touch if you'd like to find out more about either the work of CAFS or the work of the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership. We're very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much again to end Electricity Northwest.